Okay, we will get started tonight. We welcome everyone out to our work session for the Bountiful City Council, and we are discussing fiber tonight, and we'll turn the time over to Mr. Alan West.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Just by way of a very brief review, a little over a year ago, the Council asked our department and staff to review the possibility of building a fiber network to all the citizens and businesses in the city. We've gone through quite a process from a request for information, analyzing a lot of data, and at one point, staff and the fiber review team that was created felt that there were some real indications that benefits to the city could be realized by owning the project. And so last month, there were several questions that were asked and kind of a marathon meeting and a follow-up. We also continued into the council meeting and a lot of questions were asked. And so I just wanted to review some of the things that we've researched since that time.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a request to be louder so we can be heard better online. So if everyone will take note to speak loudly into their microphone.
Thank you. So some of the updates from the last work session that we had, there were a lot of questions asked about micro-trenching. We were concerned about the viability of using that process. So we met with Strata Networks, their business development director, and also a longtime project manager that had been out in the field doing micro-trenching for quite a while. We also had Alan Johnson of the Power Department, Charles Benson of the Street Department, and our Public Works Director, Lloyd Cheney, in the meeting. And with some videos and some on-site, well, some videos and then the video or the conference call that we had, they alleviated a lot of our concerns. They showed that micro-trenching is a viable option in most cases. I think there is some concern. We still need to check a couple other things to see if it would be as good in concrete streets. That's one thing that Charles Benson indicated he'd like to research a little bit more. But overall, there was a consensus that it's a viable option.
Can I just ask you a quick question about that?
Yes.
Did it seem that there would be a difference with micro-trenching in the longevity
Yes.
of the fiber?
Yeah, not only did the power department indicate that when they were having problems with the micro-trenching that was done 30 years ago or more, that there was no conduit laid down. It was just fiber. It was encased fiber, buried cable. And so with this new technology, they would actually be laying up to 4 different conduits on top of each other, and then they pack it very well, and then they seal it, and it looked like the process has improved quite a bit. And so again, the consensus was it's worth considering. We also updated some financing and customer cost data, and I'll go through that here. Just some of the estimated retail rates. These prices include the ISP cost and a kind of a projected cost of about $30 a month just for the fiber connection. Not all options or all providers offer all speeds. So as you can see that $57 a month would be the 100 megabits from Magellan, a projected cost. Utopia is $60 a month for 250 megabits per second, and Strata is $65 for that 250. It's kind of interesting to see some of the comparisons down below where for the business speeds, Magellan shows $80 a month, Utopia $155, but then when you get down to 1 gigabit, it's interesting to see $1,050 for Magellan, $340 for Utopia, and $125 for Strata. So it's kind of interesting to see disparity in those prices. I also wonder, as I was looking through this earlier, just the cost, recouping the costs of if the market would bear $340 a month for a 1 gigabit service for a business. Bountiful City is paying about $900 a month for our 1 gigabit service. However, that includes the original build out. We contracted with Utopia so that they would build the fiber, bring the fiber into us. And so that once we pay off that original purchase, it would probably be reduced to a few $100s a month. And one little side note too, I think I've mentioned this before, but we also have some services at Town Square, and we also have a secondary fiber circuit coming into the power department, and it's like $50 a month. So for a gig. And again, that's because we've already paid for the infrastructure, and so we're just paying for a location, a connection point. This one's a little bit more complicated, but I wanted to go through this a little more thoroughly than we did last month. The estimated construction cost comparison, starting with an estimate that we're going to use primarily boring. And we've talked about the pros and cons of using aerial. It doesn't take that out of the equation. There's still a possibility that we could use aerial where possible, but as we've indicated before, there's a lot of problems regarding pole height and the ability to do that. But for Magellan, their total capital and funding costs based on 80% boring and 20% trenching was nearly $57 million. Utopia would be $45 million. And then Strata showed two different prices. One was $57 million. And they also showed a $43 million. That would be based on 95% micro trenching. The interest rates are fluctuating a little bit, but this is based on last month. I think the Magellan interest rates and the Strata interest rate projection was rounded up a little bit. Utopia gave more of an accurate recent bond rate that they got.
Well, maybe I can address those just really quickly.
Okay.
All of these are assumptions. We had to start with a lot of assumptions, not knowing what the interest rate, for example, would be at the time that financing was done, regardless of who did it. So we estimated a very, very conservative 5% and told Strata to estimate the same amount. And then Utopia estimated that if they were to go out to bond in a very, very conservative way, that it would be 4.3%. Just by way of information and comparison, so today we had our bond sale for our $8 million. We ended up with a true interest cost of 3.67%. That's the interest rate that we'll have on our bonds for, on average for the life of the bonds, which we were very pleased with, and that was about what we expected. So, you know, the interest rate that we end up with will greatly influence the ultimate cost. You would see a significant reduction in, for example, Magellan's construction cost of $56.7 million if they were assuming 4.3 like Utopia is. So, at any rate, just wanted to pass that along.
And as Gary is telling you more about this comparison, I just wanted to express appreciation to Tyson. He helped us sort through all this data to try to compare apples with apples, and it was a pretty big project. So he's had a lot of practice doing that too, hasn't he? So the construction length, all of them are projecting 36 months. I put the asterisks there because Utopia had indicated that if there was a possibility to get an exemption on the moratorium, they felt they could do a complete build-out in 2 years. And then the estimated take rates necessary to cover the bond costs, 43% for Magellan. And that's using an assumption that 10% of their customers would be 100 megabit per second, 60% 500 megabits per second, and 30% the 1 gig. Utopia didn't have that breakdown, but Strata also showed 75% of their customers would have the 250 megabit service. 25% 500 megabit service. And then again, going back up here, yes.
Alan, could you go back really quickly? Sorry, go forward. There we go. 61% estimated take rate necessary to cover the bond cost for Strata, that assumes their $57 million cost. So it would obviously be much less than that, the take rate, if we were to use micro trenching and Strata were to do it, and, you know, all of these assumptions, but
And
just
bond
to point,
rate less.
just to point out that that take rate is really tied to the cost of the project, and so a less expensive project is going to require a much smaller take rate.
Thank you.
While we're on this slide, may I ask a question, Mayor? For Utopia, for their take rate percentage assumptions, do we have an update on that statistic and where it says pending, but where's the dash mark here, or is that?
Yeah, they didn't
cut?
break it down based on, they haven't provided that. They didn't break it down based on the assumption of what percentage of customers would have what services.
Right. Thank you.
We wanted to also address a few critical questions that were asked recently. Are the benefits of owning the network worth the risk to the city of taking on the financial responsibility for the project? So we wanted to discuss the important benefits. The first one is ownership and control of the fiber network. We would have ownership, we'd have control. As the potential providers have indicated, if they enter into a partnership with us, they can't give up all control. There'll be some negotiation, so, but we would have more of a control over the network, and we would be free to do whatever we wanted with the fiber down the road. We'd also have more control over customer pricing. Some cities have even subsidized the initial subscription rates to bring the cost down to build up the take rates. But price reduction could also be considered after the bond is paid off. There is a possibility for future revenue from leasing excess fiber. That could be for 5G development, or even vendors that have come into the city that want to use our fiber to transmit data or tie in their own networks within the city. We also have current and future smart city initiatives. I have a slide later if we want to get into that, of some of the smart city things that can be implemented in the city.
Could I ask a question, Mayor? Okay, so with regard to the potential future revenue with this subleasing possibility, were in your research on this and preparing the staff report, were you able to find any actual projected revenues, or what other cities maybe of comparable size that are doing this, what their revenues are on that piece of the pie?
On that piece of pie? I don't have that information. We've talked about going out to many of the cities and talking to them individually, especially as we get to the point of issuing an RFP and talking to current customers of the potential providers and finding out the real answers to those potential revenues. Yeah, so I don't have data on that.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last item was future benefits to be realized as technology advances. The note down at the bottom, the fiber project team feels that the benefits of Bountiful City owning the network are worth the risk of bonding. It's difficult to project what yet unforeseen benefits may be realized, but the development of new technologies is happening more quickly now than ever. The importance of having a fiber network in cities has become more and more important. It has been a business draw in some cases, and as we've even heard in public comment here, there are people that are very anxious to get fiber in the city, and yeah, they've experienced it in other cities, and it'd be a really good draw. One of the critical questions that was asked recently was how soon can construction start? Once a request for proposal is released to potential providers, the RFP process could take a few months. Following the RFP review, contract negotiations would follow. Considering the construction moratorium, fiber installation can likely begin the first quarter of 2023. Utopia has indicated they've already done a high-level design, just as one of the examples. And if they own the network, they state that they could be ready for construction in some areas within a few months. If we enter into a partnership with Utopia, for example, the project could start once Bountiful City secures the financing. So the estimated time from contract to design to construction could also vary depending on the resources available to each of the potential providers. That could depend on their ability to procure material, their staffing, their subcontracting, so forth. And also, there's quite a variety from the 4 providers that we interviewed directly, which includes Google, Utopia, Entry Point, and Strata. Their previous experience and the number of subcontractors that they engaged with would vary quite a bit.
Alan, so on that point, with Utopia's comment, with the moratorium, so let's assume that if we were ready today to, say, join UIA, they say within 4 months, but 4 months from today is essentially October, and then the moratorium starts. So I think even under that scenario, we're not looking at being able to start construction until really the end of the first quarter of 2023. Is that right?
Yes.
But that moratorium, there could be some negotiation there. Is that true?
Yes, but the other piece here is that, we would provide that to any partner or any provider, right?
Yes.
If it's a good idea for Utopia, it'd be a good idea for Google Fiber or anybody else. And so I think that's certainly a conversation that we're willing to have. What we don't want to do is jeopardize our own infrastructure in order to do that. Anything that would compromise the integrity of our streets because you've got to put in a cold patch instead of a permanent solution we'd want to avoid. But, if there was some portion that was aerial or boring that could be done that wouldn't disturb, certainly we're going to want to do anything that's going to allow us to move as quickly as possible.
Or if we have a really mild winter,
Right, yeah.
there could be factors like that.
Yep.
Just a reminder for everyone to speak up.
Thank you. This is almost restating a previous question, but it kind of go in a different direction. Is finding a partner to design, construct, and operate a city-owned network a viable option? And I apologize for reading, but there's a lot of detail here. A public-private or a public-public partnership is not only possible, but is also considered a best practice by many in the industry. Utopia UIA participates in this kind of arrangement with Woodland Hills, Utah, and Bozeman, Montana. The city of Fort Collins, Colorado owns and operates its own system, but provides services to 3 neighboring communities that also own their own networks. In a recent National Fiber Infrastructure Conference held in Nashville, Tennessee, called Fiber Connects, Google Fiber discussed their willingness to partner in this way, and an entire session of the conference was dedicated to public-private partnerships. As I was mentioning Fort Collins and others, we did do some other research, and we noticed that Chattanooga, Tennessee has released some videos regarding the benefits of fiber to their city, and we didn't get detail from them, but they've realized that they consider a huge financial benefit to the city. So it is staff's opinion that the best way to realize the potential benefits, current and future, for residents and businesses of Bountiful, while mitigating the risks of starting a fiber service on our own, It is to partner with a private or public sector expert like Utopia, Strata, or Google Fiber. So getting right down to the recommendation, based on our research and analysis, the fiber project team feels that there are significant and long-term advantages to Bountiful City owning the fiber network. We therefore recommend that the city issue an RFQ, I put an RF question mark, requesting proposals for a provider to partner with Bountiful City in a city-owned, provider-built and operated fiber network. And the reason I put RFP, RFQ, RF question mark, we could put out a request for proposal, request for quote, request for qualifications, request for information similar to what we did before, but we would have to analyze that and decide what that looks like. Some RFPs have been so specific that it eliminates the potential of some providers participating and say, you know, we can't do what the city wants if we get too specific with the request for proposal. I'm aware of a couple cities in the state of Utah that have requested or issued RFPs. I think Kaysville's one of them, that some vendors didn't reply because of the restrictions in the RFPs. But that's just a little side note there.
Our goal, if this is the direction that the council goes, would be to work with an entity or an individual, and I made some contacts at the Fiber Connects conference that could help us with this, to draft an RFP or RFQ or RFI or whatever that would provide the greatest ability for the city to negotiate and provide the greatest opportunity for the most number of respondents. And so, we'd want to have it written in a way that outlines what our expectations are, but also encourages as much participation from possible vendors as we can get.
So it is our request to the mayor and council to get direction as to what staff and the fiber review team should be doing.
Thanks. Thank you for that. Are you open now for questions? Okay, great. I'm sure that the council has many questions, and Richard, I don't want to put you on the spot. It's fine. Councilman Higginson, if you're not ready to discuss, but since you've been serving on the committee, I'd be interested in your thoughts or questions, and of course, interested in all of the council's questions, whoever would like to ask any.
Be happy to make a couple of comments. Most of the questions that I've had have been answered, most recently with the email that our city manager sent to all of us with some great information in it. I think the thing that's most important, to reiterate right now is the fact that the city has had a policy against microtrenching based on experience, based on a number of things. The technology that was involved with it in the past, and based on the experience that we've had with our street light system. And I just want to reiterate the fact that technology in microtrenching has changed. And the depth that the conduit is installed now, the fact that the product is going into conduit, the fact that flowable fill is used, a structural fill is used that won't allow roadways to collapse over time, and the fact that it's sealed with a hot sealant on the top, I think ensures that we can avoid most of the problems that have recently plagued our streetlight system, which I would note a system that was kind of cobbled together poorly and quickly and still lasted mostly 40 or so years. So if we can do it cheap and we can have great service for our residents that is hastened by that process, and also get 40 years out of the network, I'd be satisfied. And I probably wouldn't be around to hear people complain when it failed. I think that's the biggest change, though, that I think we need to consider. There's also the fact that we could implement a a more rapid pole replacement program for our power department and benefit both the power department and the installation of our fiber network by getting those poles replaced, able to hang cable on them sooner. And like I say, in so doing, benefit both of those services. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. Thanks.
Thank you. What other discussion do we have?
Mayor, I'll make a comment. Obviously, this is something that we're all taking very seriously and consider the long-term impacts and possibilities on and for the residents of Bountiful, as if in a city-owned model, if that were to be the direction we take, I view the residents of Bountiful as the owners, really. And so I'm a person who likes the marketplace, the private marketplace, and I think that it serves us well in appropriate situations. In this case, I think that it would behoove us to examine the possibility, however, of a public-private partnership and see what that would look like, and invite all of the relevant players to come to the table and bring an RFP. I have concerns. I have there are a few reasons why I think this could be advantageous. One is where we'll be able to rely on industry expertise, know-how, their ability and knowledge on due diligence and modeling. Also, we will be able to rely on our well-run city utilities and that expertise that we have in that power department and so on and so forth within the city. And if we find that those two things are able to dovetail, then it could be a win-win. However, I also recognize that any resources that we allocate to this will be a reallocation of resources. And so it has to be done strategically, wisely, and with the least amount of disruption or risk to Bountiful residents. And so I am in favor of moving forward with this RFP process. However, I would ask that, and I'm not an RFP drafter. I mean, that's staff, that's your expertise in Bailiwick, but I would hope that in the RFP that we would include certain things like what would be the cost of smart city application build out. That could be included in the general RFP or as a separate proposal that is part of under the umbrella. I am curious and think it would be very beneficial to know about which of any of the RFP submitters, what it would look like for the due diligence and for the easements, specifically with regard to the fiber huts, and what they anticipate that would look like, and the burden that may put on the city, as opposed to would they assume that burden. I'm concerned about cost for build out with wanting to know that everybody, when I look up here, it's obvious that everyone's not dealing with the same information. You have providers with different projected interest rates, different projected build-out models. So I would hope that we'll put out specific build-out models with percentages for boring, micro-trenching, aerial, and specific interest rate models, maybe 2 or 3, because we know that that is not something that is static. That is a bouncing ball right now, and it's on the up it's on the upward bounce. I would hope that we could also, and I know these things will be included, but projected take rates based on all of this other information. Bonding requirements by the city, what is the feasibility of our bonding for this specific amount of money with regard to our other bonding obligations right now that we currently are encumbered by as city and residents. And just kind of finally, another thing that I hope we would include would be specifically if it would be, I don't know, it seems like it would be ideal to get the bonding all wrapped up and tied neatly with a bow before any of this build-out comes, but I don't think that's the realistic option. We're gonna have to be ordering, procuring large amounts of fiber and supplies and different things. And how would those upfront costs be anticipated? Just, this wouldn't be part of the RFP, but a request as a council member, how would we anticipate paying for those upfront costs prior to bonding and the impact to city budgets and revenues, and probably not revenues, but budgets. And just another request, hoping that maybe we could do a little more digging and find out some of these projected revenue streams with dark fiber and some of those other options to see how would that really come into play. And potentially, I am very moved by the staff report that shows that we, as a city-owned fiber network, we have the ability to lower the rates for our residents when, later down the road. But if we're making, certain revenues through, I don't know all the revenue streams, dark fiber, et cetera, how soon could those cost reductions maybe come into play? Kind of based on what we're seeing other cities do. So with that being said, I'll just yield the microphone, but I'm in favor of going forward with the RFP because I believe it will give us the ability to look and assess our risk, give us our risks, the risk to our residents, cost-benefit analysis more accurately, and that's all for right now.
Great, thank you. Councilwoman Bradshaw.
Sure, I have a couple questions for our staff. As I've been studying this issue and trying to distill down what I think are the most important considerations, the residents and that the benefits to the residents, the risks to the residents, and making sure any value would accrue ultimately to the residents have really guided my thinking. And so as we've learned more about dark fiber, and that it's not the dark side.
Maybe you can define that, just for anyone who's...
I don't think I should define it. I think Alan should define it. But that's where my first kind of set of questions lead is I've been interested in dark fiber leases. So if you want to help everyone understand what that is. And then I'm really curious about what the market for those leases are and how that might help pay off bonds faster, and how that would be potentially a benefit in a P3 type of arrangement. So Alan, I'll go to you for dark fiber.
Okay, first off,
definition, since the mayor asked.
yeah, it had been indicated that my use of the word dark fiber in a previous document might have sounded like the dark web, which is kind of a undercover, it's used by the bad actors, the threat actors, but dark fiber is essentially if we were to install 96 pair fiber cable and we need 48 pair for our network, that would leave 48 pair left over that's dark. It's not lit up, it's not connected to a network, it's not tied into what's called a cartridge on our network, on our fiber rack.
So would it be safe to describe it as unused capacity or excess capacity that we could lease to somebody while we're not needing it for Bountiful's residents?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is, and Councilman Bell points out temporarily, maybe we grow to need it, but at least on the short term, maybe medium term, it's available for us to lease out. So I'm curious, what do we think what have you learned about the market for this, and what entities are out there that would want it, and what might we then use as a return so that residents would see that bond potentially retired faster?
At the conference I went to, the Fiber Connect, they talked about this aspect of leasing fiber. And I'll preface it by saying the one thing that nearly every system that spoke, and that's public, both public and private, that they recommended to anybody getting into the business was to not sell yourself short by putting in too little fiber in an attempt to just save a few pennies, because the cost is really the trenching and the installation and the labor. The cost of the materials are a small piece of that. And because they all pointed out that the real revenue generator for this is the ability to lease dark fiber, as well as have the capacity for all of the technological advancements that we can't yet foresee. One of the examples that, to answer your question, that was raised was the idea of 5G wireless. And for those that might not be familiar with wireless technology and how it works, I'm going to go kind of right back to the basics. And they pointed out, too, in their efforts, and I think this may have been Google, talked about their efforts for broadband and helping the federal government understand there's kind of a misunderstanding of how wireless works. You know, if you pick up a phone and you call Washington, D.C. from Bountiful, it's not a situation where your phone call, goes to the nearest cell tower and then bounces to the next cell tower, and then the next cell tower somehow magically through the air. It's only that last little, few thousand feet from the phone call from your phone to the tower. That tower then is connected either through fiber or coax or some other cable across country to the tower where the call is being transmitted. So 99% of all of our emails, calls, everything else that we do wirelessly is still being transmitted by cable. Even transatlantic, there's fiber optics in the oceans that connect all the continents. And so with advancing technologies like 5G, 5G is a wireless technology that allows for a lot of data to be broadcast. It's like a big hose, essentially. It's a wired hose, but it cannot transmit very far. So it requires that there be more small cell towers more frequently, say every block. Every single one of those has to be attached to a wire. They have to be attached to fiber or cable. And so in the future, in the near future, when 5G and whatever comes after that, 6G, LTE is an example of past technology, and 2G and 3G. But in the future, when that technology happens, all of it has to be connected to fiber. And the city's not going to, at that point, provide or the government's not going to provide a phone network. It's the phone companies, it's the private sector that are going to come and need to attach to the fiber. So that's one example of potential future revenue from
So in that
owning
example,
the fiber.
a traditional phone carrier like a CenturyLink or a cell phone carrier like an AT&T or Verizon might pay us to build a tower connected to our fiber line and use that excess capacity, pay us some type of a rent.
Yes. So although the model would be more like they would attach a tower on one of our light poles, and that would connect then down the light pole to fiber that we have nearby in the street.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Trying to understand the dark fiber. So thinking of Bountiful's geography and our parameters, we would have fiber within our city that's not being utilized. So if someone wanted to use that, let's say it's a company that's outside of Bountiful, how would, or would it be entirely for inside Bountiful? So tell me how that would work. So if we're limited in our 20 square miles of Bountiful, how does that excess fiber help another business that would pay us money outside of Bountiful?
Well, so let's assume that that's a business model that goes to the home. It's some service that they're providing to the home, or maybe a better example would maybe be a home-based business, something that's entirely virtual, based out of someone's home on, the northeast side of Bountiful, but they just need a lot of capacity. That's a situation where they could use our fiber, and then our fiber, of course, like every other current system, including electrical system, links up with another system someplace else. So it'd be almost an interchange kind of a
It
situation.
would be contractual, like they would come to the city and they would say, can we buy this? And then we would agree.
That's assuming they needed more than what we were offering to the public at 1 gig or 10 gigs.
Right, or they needed it for some reason, an independent connection or something.
So what about, this is kind of a scenario question to maybe play with. Let's say that in 5 or 6 years, AT&T is now selling a 6G iPhone that I feel I need to have, so that I can call people in Washington, D.C. faster. Is this a scenario where AT&T would lease our unused fiber so that the cell tower nearest my home would pick up my calls faster on my 6G phone?
Yes, yep.
And so they'd pay, I'm assuming under this type of a scenario, they'd have some small contract with Bountiful for the cell towers that they have situated here. They could have a separate contract with Utopia in Centerville, because that's who owns their network, for the cell towers that are there, and something entirely different with Farmington for whoever owns a network there.
Right.
And each city would potentially, each city or each owning entity would charge some type of a monthly or annual access fee. Is that kind of the model that the dark fiber would generate?
Yes, that's one example that I think we can get our arms around right now, right? Not based on technology. A good analogy is what we sometimes call wheeling fees in our power grid, power system. If we generate power at Pineview. We have our own power plant there. We do not have a dedicated power line from Pineview to Bountiful, unlike the power line that goes from Bountiful to Echo Hydro. So in that case, what we do is we essentially take advantage of the excess capacity built into Rocky Mountain Power System to transmit the power that we generate from Pineview to Bountiful. It's the same thing, only it's data. Same kind of philosophy. And so we pay what we call a wheeling fee, or a handling fee, or a lease fee to Rocky Mountain Power that's built in order to be able to use their line to transmit our power.
So I guess kind of back to my original question, do we have an idea of the market that would exist for potential dark fiber if we were to build our own network? If we don't, do we have a guess, or do we have estimates, or would that come from some type of a RF question mark we might issue to understand that potential market that would help us pay bonds faster?
Yeah, we don't have those answers yet, and it's largely because we haven't really researched any of it. The idea is building in the potential for that and not limiting ourselves so that we don't have the ability to do that. Much of the conversation nationally about leasing of fiber is that we've only just begun to scratch the surface of how fiber can be used and the speeds that'll be available. And the businesses and technology that will begin to develop as fiber becomes ubiquitous in the United States. And so the prevailing wisdom among private and public fiber users is that There's just going to be increased demand. And until that technology ripens, we can't quite imagine it. Just like we couldn't probably 20 years ago have imagined the difference, but that we would all have, the kinds of phones that we have now and the demands that we have for, wireless needs. And they're just saying that fiber is, so it's hard, right now, I'm not aware of, it may be out there, but I'm not aware of any research or, it's probably out there, but what the market would look like. We just haven't looked into it.
So you're safe to say you're flagging it for potential benefit that would accrue to the residents, but we don't know yet. So if I were to think of it like, when we have excess, we sometimes have excess power at night that we sell to a commercial enterprise that sits on the border between Bountiful and Centerville, and they use it at night when our residents don't need it, and then we're able to recoup some of that cost. So this would be a very similar potential that is out there of when we're not using it, we can lease it to somebody else. The residents would get the benefit of it, and it doesn't really cause us any impact on the front end.
Right.
I have like a couple other questions, but I don't want to hog the mic because I'm sure others do, and I can always come back to my next questions.
I have a question that kind of piggybacks on this issue, Kate. So I'd like to just ask, as far as, do we have any idea, Alan, on what this additional cost might be to bring in more capacity for this dark fiber or excess leasable fiber? And how would that impact our build-out costs? Is that something that would be appropriate for the RFP? Or I think that would be important information, how bringing in this additional fiber, and in my mind, just because I've seen a lot of pictures of it, I'm just thinking additional fiber bundles, but bringing that additional amount, and we're building for, I'm sure, projected and hopeful take rates, but also for just what we're anticipating will be utilized by residents and businesses. I'm sure there's been modeling on what that will likely look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So just adding in this additional capacity for this leasable fiber.
That's a very good question.
How's that impact?
And
build-out?
I am pretty confident that every provider, every fiber builder in the country over provisions, puts more fiber in than they think they'll need. And I don't know what the figures are, but maybe double. If we were to put a 10-mile fiber circuit in with 48 pair, maybe we're going to spend several $100,000. And if we put 96 pair in, it's not going to cost double. I don't know what the fraction is, but so not only would Utopia, Strata, Google, whoever they are, they would over-provision that. I'm fairly confident that their proposals that we have that we've looked at include over-provisioning, providing more fiber than we're going to need. To give you an example, again, we built our own fiber network, just a downtown ring 20-something years ago, and in some cases there's 48 pair, 96 pair. We have already subleased some of those to UDOT to connect to cameras. It was kind of a mutual agreement thing where they gave us access to cameras. And they have also offered us use of their conduit as an exchange. That's just one minor example. I know that there are some other fiber projects near here that they've only put in as much fiber as they're going to need, and they're already scrambling, wishing they had done more. So I think, to answer your question, I think every provider is going to over-provision. We can ask for specifications on that, but I think
The majority of the cost is the labor and the trenching, and the materials are a smaller piece
Yeah.
of what really adds up.
right.
in
The
these
cost
projects.
per foot for the fiber cable is not much compared to the cost per foot to lay it.
Thank you. I have a few quick comments. For me, what's always been important is that the subscribers pay, that this project is paid by subscriber fees. And so that's, I know, the model that we're looking at, so that no one is paying for this that isn't utilizing it. I'm excited about fiber to home. We saw during COVID how important it was that we could have that. We really needed better access, and also fiber to business. But in addition to just having good, fast, reliable internet in our homes and in our businesses in Bountiful, the smart city applications, things like future connectivity for things like traffic lights and irrigation systems and SCADA, and there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense that Bountiful would own and operate that infrastructure. So to me, I see it as a real need for the future for our city. And what other questions does the council have?
Oh, do you have more, or do you mind if I? I have learned so much, and just in the past week, as far as, in my mind, fiber was just internet. And then just learning in the last, few days, few weeks, how much more it offers our city and our residents and businesses with smart city solutions and all of these things and future utilities. And it's just been a huge learning experience and amazing. And so, I've always been really excited about fiber, but now I'm really excited about fiber. But a few things, and help me if I am explaining this help me if I'm not explaining this correctly as far as I understand it. Whether we do city-owned or if we do provider-owned network, we have to bond either way, correct?
So it depends on the owner. If we do a city-owned, we would finance it, we would bond ourselves. If we were, for example, to become a UIA city, UIA would finance the project themselves, but we would agree to pay any difference between if they didn't have high enough take rates to cover the costs of the bonds.
So we would be responsible for the shortfall,
Yes.
even if we don't bond through a provider-owned network.
Right. And then Google Fiber has said that they would just, if they owned it, they would just come in and finance it themselves and.
Regardless of any shortfall.
Right.
Okay. So that's good. So, because to the mayor's point, as far as only subscribers paying, which I agree. Unfortunately, with that, if we don't have enough subscribers, the city then has to make up the shortfall through from our money. So that's just something that I've been thinking of as I'm going through this this process. And then when the city's owned networks with Bozeman, Montana, is it Bozeman or Bozeman? It's Bozeman, correct? Bozeman, Fort Collins, Woodland Hills. I looked up the populations of each of these cities. Woodland Hills, beautiful, but it only has about 1,400 people. So that's not really comparable to Bountiful. Fort Collins has 166,000 in their population. Bozeman has 48,000. So Bozeman is a more comparable city to Bountiful. So I'm just thinking if these cities have been doing it and if their population is comparable to us, that just gives me a little bit more confidence if we were to go into a city-owned network or some kind of a partnership with a provider. And then I asked, and another thing that is helps me be a little bit more comfortable setting out, releasing an RFP or an RFQ or what other acronym am I missing? Oh, there it is, or just an RF. I think Bountiful is in a very unique situation in that we have our experience with Bountiful Power to lean on. And it's been very well run. And I asked Tyson really quickly, I just said, what revenue has come to the city from Bountiful Light and Power? Which then in turns helps keep costs low for our residents. And in 16 years, am I okay to share this? In 16 years, the total was 38,116,000, or 100, am I looking at this right? Yes, $38,116,117.91. But then if you subtract about $12 million from when we had to do some for the light and power.
Yeah, it was so the city took some of that money and transferred it back to the power department to help build the turbines,
For the turbines.
the gas turbine
So
project.
if you take out that cost, then the money that came right back to the city, it's $25,799,790.96. So that came back to the city, which again helps keep costs low. And that's just in 16 years. That's not going back 40 years. So because we have that, and because that has helped, I think just with the city's fiscal policy, and it's just I'm just in awe. It's a lot, it's a huge sum of money to get back to the residents. And so when I'm looking at fiber, whether we do city-owned or with a partner, at some point, either the city or Utopia or Strata or someone is going to be making a profit at some point. And so in my mind, if that profit can be the city, that we can then put that money back into the city. You always hear in business, you want to reinvest in yourself. You want to keep reinvesting in your own company. And so as residents, this is an opportunity for us to reinvest in our own city, in our own company. And for that reason, I am really excited to release an RFP, RFQ, or an RF to request a provider partner proposal. So many different words to say. So sorry, now I'm rambling, but it's really exciting, and it's something that our city needs. And this has been a long conversation. I think we've been talking about this a year and a half, almost 2 years. But I'm really grateful that we have taken the time. Of course, we all want it done yesterday. But I think because this is so long-lasting and because there are so many different applications for fiber, it's really important that we get this done right and do it in a way that it can really serve residents for a really long time, even though Richard won't be around to hear them complain. Go ahead.
So in keeping with your theme of bonding and wanting to kind of drill down on that, making sure we understand who pays, we just issued a bond for Washington Park and Trails, and the city received a really great bond rating. Incredible bond rating based on the strength of our reserves and our reserve policy, and the strength of our residents and their property that backs that bond. This would be a kind of a different type of bond, a subscriber bond. So I'd love to have that explored and explained a little bit more. Could we expect a similar rating as what we've just received for this different category of bond? Does it have any different provisions than the GO bond that we've become more familiar with? How might it compare to the power revenue bonds that we've dealt with in the past? Or is it such a different, unique animal that it doesn't compare well to either of those types?
Yeah, it's not a different animal. It's almost identical. In some regards, it's perfectly identical to the power bonds that we recently paid off early, 10 years early. They're called lease revenue bonds, and the money that you pledge to repay the bonds are the revenues that you generate from the users. So in the case of our power bond, we borrowed $20 million. In addition to the 12 that the city donated, might I say donated, the city's general fund put back in the power fund, we borrowed $20 million to build the gas turbine plant. And the rating for that bond was a AA minus, so 2 steps below our general obligation bond. That's pretty typical. That you would see that kind of a difference between a general obligation bond and a revenue bond.
Is that because of its narrower base of people that would pay it back?
Yes. Yep. With a general obligation bond, one, you have a dedicated revenue source that voters approved, and the rate, and we guarantee to the bondholders that the tax rate will be increased to whatever it needs to be in order to pay off the bond. It's called the full faith and credit of the city. So it's very, very secure, and you typically get a higher bond rating. With a revenue bond, where it is that narrower source of revenue, it's typically just a couple of points lower as a bond rating, but still very much a marketable bond. So you could expect the interest rate to be slightly higher than we did for our general obligation bond.
How are we able to pay off that power bond faster?
The answer is essentially the savings to the system that we saw because of the power plant. We were buying less and less power off the market at peak times. That was the whole intent of the plant, which meant there were greater savings. It's also a combination of the fact that we had a lot of power sales. We were able to, through the work of Alan and his department, buy power cheaply off the market when we needed to, but we essentially realized more savings than we anticipated, and it just made sense at that point to pay off our debt.
This is one of those things that as I've been thinking about this for the past several months and come back to our closest example that I can think of, the power department, where whenever there were benefits that they accrued to the residents, that has kind of become a guiding philosophy for me, that when we were able to pay off a bond faster, we did so, and that when there's revenues to be shared, they come back to the residents through the general fund and in lower rates. So I have another kind of set of questions about smart cities, unless anyone wants to jump in.
Councilman Bell, I know he wanted to make a comment. Maybe he can comment, and then we can go back to you.
I have quite a few. I know our time is limited, and we all have things that we want to say. Can I just ask one question, going backwards a little bit has anyone been in touch with Bozeman or Fort Collins, with those cities, and what has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them? Learning curves that they've gone through?
Not directly yet,
Okay.
no, but I think that's a really good idea.
I think it would be really helpful to learn from those that have gone before us and what hasn't worked and what has worked
We
as
have
well.
talked about site visits, making site visits.
Yeah, I think that's great, but phone calls too. I'll maybe have some comments, and for sake of time, I'll just kind of cruise through these a little bit through my notes. When thinking of like ownership versus partnering with anyone else over an extended period of time, which obviously this would be, I think ownership is always, not always, mostly or generally better, because the benefits are realized and are able to put back to the shareholders or the owners of that, and which is our taxpayers and our residents. And so that is really exciting to me. But that doesn't come without additional risk, as Councilwoman Price Hewish mentioned earlier. What's the additional cost of that system, and what's that take rate? And I think that's an important question, to recognize that this does have additional cost and expenses. From what we initially, our goal was, is my understanding, was to provide fiber to the home. Now, if there are benefits, which I believe there are, to have a city-owned and citywide fiber system that we talked about, smart city and our meters and traffic lights and our parks and Wi-Fi and all those things, I think those are very real benefits to all of us, which I think need to be a part of the conversation, and we are, and I'm glad we are having that conversation. But it comes with additional risk, which we need to be aware of and mitigate and limit. I think that's my biggest concern, is incurring this cost and the additional burden to our taxpayers. And but at the flip side, it's a huge windfall, potentially. And so we need to be very conscientious about how to limit that risk, and in our contracts, in our marketing, in our, assuming we move forward, to increase our take rate and have all the benefits that come with that fiber. And also that time is money. I think the longer this goes on, the more expensive it is, and I think we'll see less benefits to the city. Earlier in your presentation, Alan, you mentioned that it's a draw to the city, and I think that's true. I think the reverse is also true, is not having it as a deterrent to businesses. But the longer that goes on, the less benefit it is, because other cities within the Wasatch Front and the country will also have fiber. At the same time, I think fiber is, the need for fiber is growing, and which will limit the access to contractors and to materials. So I think time is very critical here. I know I'm kind of rambling, but I'm going through my thoughts and the things that are going through my mind in this process. But I think it's important that we limit the risk, understand what that is, and I think there's a significant benefit to the city, to the residents, over a long time, over a long period of time. Anyway, that's all my thoughts for now.
Thanks. Councilwoman Bradshaw?
So on the smart city list that we were given of different features, you know, last meeting we had quite a conversation about watering and the drought and what other areas are able to do if they're able to see in real time their water usage from a smart meter versus what our residents are able to do. Some of those things are out of our control because the water districts would need to meter, but there's some that would be in ours. And so in looking at these smart city features, I think there are some that, there's some that are in like the nice to have bucket, like that would be cool. And then there are some that I think really tie back to things that would be really valuable. For instance, better ways to use water in a desert. And what I wanted to make sure I understood correctly is that if we were able to own our own fiber infrastructure, we can build in enough extra capacity, dark fiber, so that we can have those smart features for a very minimal cost. If a private entity were to own the network, they would charge us for those costs. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think so, to the degree to which the fiber that we have put in for the benefit of the city has capacity, there wouldn't likely be an additional charge. But if we get to the point where, so let's take Alan's example, let's say it takes 48 strands to serve all of Bountiful. If there's capacity within those 48 strands, then chances are another operator, whether that's Google, I don't know about Google, but I know with Utopia, for example, they've said, no, you'd be able to take advantage of that. But if we ever exceed that, then we would be competing with other entities to lease the fiber that they own. So the short answer is yes. We would not have to pay any kind of monthly fees or anything like that to take advantage of what essentially is our own infrastructure.
I think in the interest of, you wanting to have us kind of get to a conclusion, I'll stop there. Just that I really do think some of these smart features are very interesting. Some of them to me fall in the, gee whiz, if I were able to buy all the gadgets I wanted bucket, and some fall in the, these would make us truly better, help our residents be better, be smarter about our own water consumption in a way that we just can't right now, that I think are really worth exploring, in my opinion. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Great comments, everyone. So I'm hoping that you can give staff some direction if you feel comfortable moving ahead, requesting an RFP, moving ahead with that, or any questions that you have to, if there's any last things that you're still wondering about or that you need information about, now's the time.
Mayor, so there's been a lot said tonight about getting additional information about the dark fiber capabilities, those leasing options. I'm just also hoping that maybe if we move forward with the RFP process, that we can get that information, additional information like was stated about other cities who are doing this unique model. I guess not that unique because a lot of cities are doing it, so this public-private partnership model. But also, I'm wondering if we could look into potential mitigation strategies that might help, and this would just be a request maybe from staff. Could we look at mitigation strategies that would help with the possibility of keeping fees low, but, and which would then assist with take rates? And like one of those might be a longer-term bond or some other type of strategies that might help build in some just better take rate, I guess. I mean, appetite for the take rate on the fiber network, which in turn would help with that, as you were talking about this bond, the paying off revenue bond, because as we know, if we don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if we don't meet the projected revenues for the bond, which we pay every month, then can you just explain how that then in turn impacts every Bountiful resident?
Sure, there are options, right? One is that you increase fees to existing users. Another is that you subsidize the payments from other city sources. So that would be, using our reserves to subsidize those, or other general fund type revenues that would subsidize the fees.
Mm-hmm. And can I just quickly follow up? So if that were to happen, it's my understanding that with UIA, and I don't know if it's happened, but in instances where that may happen with UIA, then that is viewed more as a loan, and then when revenues increase, then that gets paid back. Is that correct?
Ooh, that's a good question.
And
I don't know if it's a loan that gets paid back, or if the city just writes a check monthly for the difference between. It's probably the former. It's probably some cost that they incur, and then, but I can tell you it hasn't happened with UIA, which is good.
Ever.
Yeah.
okay.
Good questions.
What other questions do we have?
Can I ask one?
Please.
Maybe I can sum up, and you can tell me if we're off base or not, but it's, the direction that I'm hearing is, it sounds like the council unanimously wants to move forward with a city-owned network and issue an RF something to solicit a partner. So that's the first question. Is that correct?
I'll clarify. I'm okay moving forward with an RFP to get information so that we can make that decision.
Well, so, yeah, that's a good clarification, because I think in order to move forward, we have to pick a direction. And we need to pick a direction of, are we going to own it or are we not going to own it? And we really can't go down the path with these vendors and expect them to provide the kind of data if we're not committed to a direction. So I guess I'm kind of asking tonight, are you comfortable with going down the path? It doesn't commit us anything but we're kind of looking for that direction tonight so that we can also begin the marketing and other things, that this is the direction the city's going.
Can I ask a clarifying question along the lines of Councilman Bell? If we were to indicate that there's universal support for an RFP, would the council have an opportunity to review the RFP before it was released?
Of course.
I think that's maybe some of what we'd like to see. I think wanting to make sure that we're keeping a P3 partnership really broad is important to me, so that we're able to get potentially a lot of proposals back and can then evaluate on what's brings the most value to residents with the least risk.
Yes, absolutely, the council can review the RFP.
I think just piggybacking on Councilmember Bell and Bradshaw is wanting, definitely moving in this direction, and but if we find that the RFPs bring us information that are unacceptable to the residents as far as risk, then we're going to need to have that leeway.
And you do. There's nothing
And-
in an RFP
right,
that commits you
yeah.
to
So I think
accepting those.
just acknowledging that to the residents of Bountiful, that this is to move in a direction, get that information that will hopefully, we believe, and based on staff's recommendation and all the massive amounts of information we've received, that we believe this is the most mutually beneficial path at this point. And if and when we discover otherwise or not, then we reserve the right to change direction if we feel like this is not going to be the most beneficial path for residents. And as our mayor has so pointedly and directly stated, this should be a system that is borne by subscribers, but will be a system that really has so many benefits to those subscribers.
And thank you for that clarification. I agree with that. And just so people who are listening at home, am I correct in saying Utopia, Google, and Strata are all open to a public-private partnership?
They have all indicated currently or in the past that they would be interested in that, yes.
Meaning where the city would own it, but they would run it.
Right.
So essentially Utopia, Google, and Strata are all still on the table. It's just potentially looking a little different.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to clarify, Google included in that?
So when they responded to our initial request for information, they didn't actually respond with any data. They said, let's sit down with you and we'll talk about, there are a lot of ways we can skin this cat. And we didn't really follow through on that at that time, because it wasn't what we were looking for at the time. We wanted them to tell us what they thought was possible, and they just didn't really respond. I think with a more specific now RFP and direction of the city wants to own it, tell us what that would take, that they're going to want to respond.
Could I also
Please.
clarify a little bit? In the interview with Google, they did cite 2 other cities at least in which the city owns the network. Google operates the network for the city. So it's not something that's foreign to them. They did say in the interview that they'd be interested in that, but they didn't provide any data on any details. So, but they're doing that other places.
Thank you.
But this is the big step, I guess I was trying to clarify is, as staff, if we know that what the council wants to do is issue an RFP that the basis of which is the city wants to own it, and we want the responders to tell us what it would take to design, operate, and build it, then that gives us, that's the kind of direction we need so that we can build a specific RFP. And I'm hearing that that's the direction you want to go. But again, that doesn't obligate you to make any decisions once you see the RFPs come in.
Where does Entry Point, you'd mentioned them earlier in the meeting, are they also doing this type of public-private partnership?
Entry Point's more of a designer, not just an engineer, but they want to, as we talk to them, they would not operate a system or build it. They would be more on the front end of that, of helping us design it,
got
be
it.
strategic partner.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. So the second, 2 other questions then for the council that haven't quite come up, but the second is I mentioned that I've heard, I should say, loud and clear, and staff completely agrees that the formulation of the RFP and any subsequent contracts, we need as much advice as we can get. So it would be staff's recommendation that we, and I've made some contact with an individual who does this nationally that would help us develop the RFP and contracts when we get to that point as a consultant, so that we're not missing out on the things we don't know. In other words, Dirty Harry once said, a man's got to know his limitations. There are things we just simply don't know, and we'd like to rely on experts to help us fill in those gaps. So is council comfortable with that? Okay, and then the third one is I've just had some feedback from a couple of you that communication and with the residents and on what we're trying to accomplish is really important, and I think we all agree as staff. And the national conference, they talked about this as well, that as soon as we have a direction that we're looking, we need to begin communicating what that looks like, understanding that final decisions aren't made, but that's really important for getting correct information in the hands of the public as soon as possible as to the reasons we're going the path we are, and also to help with take rates. So is there interest in staff looking at maybe partnering again with somebody to help us with the communications plan specifically for fiber?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we have direction then.
Okay.
Our next steps then would be to find some help with drafting the RFP, get that drafted, then provide that to you all for review, and then move forward.
Gary, what would be, we have a lot of residents, some that are here tonight, that I'm sure interested on what that timeline is. There, a lot of interest in timelines. What do you think is a realistic timeline of when an RFP might be back to the council to review in a future meeting?
So I would say a realistic timeline of having it released would be 5 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. So that would include, back to the council before that time and review. And we probably wouldn't convene a meeting. It would be more of a situation where we'd send it out for your comments like we do with minutes and things like that. So I would say and a reasonable, aggressive timeline would be 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks of releasing an RFP.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, council. Any other last comments from anyone? Thank you.
One, if I could.
Yes, please.
I know that there are members of the council that are very focused on making sure we get this right, and there are members of the council that are anxious that we get this done soon. I'd like to see if we could get both of those desires satisfied and make sure that we move this along as quickly as we can in a quality way. So that would be my hope as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else on this, Gary?
No, thanks.
Alan? Okay, thank you so much, council. We are going to take a little break before we start our regular meeting in just a few minutes. Thank you.